thank you, are making our work possible. So I also would like to take a moment to highlight that this is the fourth book that we are presenting today. I'm honored to be joined by Professor Mar Hicks, author of Programmed Inequality. Professor Hicks, thank you for joining us today. For those who may be learning about Mar for the first time, she's an associate professor of the history of technology at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Her work focuses.
I'm at University of Virginia now, but sorry about that.
The background. Okay, great. Her work focuses on how gender and sexuality bring hidden technological dynamics to light and how women's experiences change the core narrative of the history of computing. Professor Hicks teaches courses on modern European history, the history of technology, gender and sexuality studies, STS, and disasters. I encourage you all to visit her LinkedIn and website to stay updated on her incredible work. So let's start our conversation on our book, Programmed Inequality. When I was reading your book, I got really interested on the idea of how at the beginning, on the early days of computing, working with computers and machines was often seen as complex and highly technical until women were in charge of exactly the same work. So how was the perception of this complexity changed with time? And please, can you share this, how did these perceptions shape who was considered suitable for that work?
Yeah, and you know what? It's even more interesting because it wasn't actually sequential. It was happening at the very same time. Certain work, the same work, was being viewed as highly complex, or almost clerical, nearly secretarial, based on who was doing it. And that might seem a little bit wild, but if you think about it, that happens all around us every day. Think about, for instance, the same exact job that's done by somebody in the United States versus in, let's say, India, versus somebody who is from India on an H-1B visa in the United States. You probably see where I'm going with this. All of those will literally be valued differently in terms of the salaries paid, and also culturally, from the perspective of management, they're valued very differently. So you have this really strange situation at the beginning of computing history in terms of digital electronic programming, and work that is going to evolve into things like, systems analysis and all of the things that are going to be so important to computerizing entire nations. And it's actually perceived as being nearly secretarial, nearly clerical, it's just technical, even though there is simultaneously an understanding of how complex it is.
Exactly. And can you please go deeper on how was this complexity of this kind of work and how the process of the skilling of women workers happens also at the same time?
Yeah. So one of the things that happens in the context that I look at in the UK is that there's a gender and class issue at play, and race as well. In the US, you see similar things. In the UK, it's really, really obvious what's happening. Essentially, during a period where there's a huge influx and sort of a need for women to come in to certain jobs during World War II and to do very complex technical work, women get cemented into certain new and evolving roles in computing. And the thing that I always have to mention at this point is that it doesn't happen just because of the war. It happens because in the pre-electronic days, when there were, punch card machines and tabulating machines and things that were pre-electronic computers, essentially slower electromechanical systems, women were doing that work. And so they sort of seamlessly carry over. It makes a lot of sense. But what begins happening, and I know that some of your later questions about this are going to be about this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. What begins happening is that these jobs start to become understood as more than merely technical. This is going to require a little bit of maybe a context shift for some folks in the audience, because here in our historical moment, or at least until recently, until we started saying, some people started saying that generative AI could somehow recode systems, there was a huge premium and high status attached to technical skill. And that simply wasn't the case in the early part of this period. That is something that gets built over time by professionalization. And in fact, one part of that building of prestige and that professionalization is pushing women out of certain kinds of work, even though they have the technical skills for it. So I don't want to step on later questions, so I'm going to end it there and see where you want to go next.
No, it's okay. We can just continue like the flow of the conversation, and let's see how we end this session too. So one of the things that you were mentioning is that this was a process, and that actually women already had the knowledge because they were participating on the bricks of building these technologies, or some technologies, right? So I'm very curious how these profiles of women were show up at the point that the hiring managers think, okay, we need to hire them. And why them? Why woman and not other people? Like, talk to us, how was the context at that point, and how the role of hiring managers was a very critical role for defining who was being hired for that kind of.
Yeah, so early on, what's happening is that the idea is that the people who are programming computers, the people who are doing things that we would now call like systems administration or systems analysis, the people who are doing input, that all of these people are essentially, they're kind of part of the system, not that they're part of the machine, but they're part of the system. And the goal is simply to slot people into those roles who can be as interchangeable as possible, who don't need to have any decision-making ability, even though, that's kind of false. Decisions are being made all the time. But the idea is that they're just kind of doing what they're told. And they're doing this technical work in a very straightforward fashion. And so you can start to see, if you know a little something about how women in the workforce have been perceived over the course of the 20th century, that because this work is perceived as rote, women are a go-to labor force for it. They're also paid less for most of the 20th century, legally paid less. And so they're cheaper. And this isn't just me being, sort of retrospectively saying, oh, it was a good deal. Hiring managers are literally talking to each other in like management magazines, publishing editorials or publishing how-tos about how to staff a computing installation, and saying that it's a good idea to use women because they're less expensive and they're fine to do the work. They're competent at doing the work. Another thing is, in the early days of electronic computing, there wasn't much of a career ladder. There wasn't much upward mobility because it's a brand new field and nobody knew where it was going to go. So again, put women in those roles, right? Because they don't need a career. They're just going to have children and get married and leave the workforce, or at least that's the idea of what they're supposed to do, right? Most women, in fact, didn't leave the workforce. They would come back into the workforce after, having their children. And when their children were in school, they'd come right back into the workforce. But their career trajectory was essentially stopped at whatever point they got married, for most women for a lot of the 20th century. And I mean, to the extent that my mother, who worked at IBM, when she had an engagement ring on her finger and it was known that she was going to be getting married, they made it clear to her that they expected her to resign. And so she just took off the engagement ring and pretended like she had, that the engagement had been called off. And that was in the late 20th century. So this is, unfortunately, these are issues I think a lot of people, and especially women in tech, probably understand, not in a historical sense, in a much more recent experiential way.
Mm-hmm. Because how much difference could be if we understand that these stereotypes are being, that like the system is putting on us, who help us to hack the system. If we realize that it's not just us, that this has been happening in a long time.
Sorry, let me just reframe and restate your question so I'm sure I'm understanding. Are you sort of asking about what the utility is for this history, how we can use it to understand how to change systemic injustice today? Is that what you're getting?
What I'm thinking is more like, let's say, like, for example, your mom or anybody, like, when being on that situation, like you want to have a family, but you also have to talk with your supervisor, to let her or him know that you have these plans, like, because this could change your growth at a company, your growth path at a company. So sometimes some people could feel like this is just happening to me and I have to make this hard decision by myself. But it is different if you already know that this is not just happening to you. It's a more systemic issue, and how much to be aware of this, that's my question, will make you achieve on your future career plans.
I gotcha. Yeah. So awareness is incredibly important, right? It's the first step. And then the next step, as Mia was talking about in the intro and in the interstitial, just barn burner of comments that she was giving prior to this talk, you have to build grassroots power. You can do that in a variety of ways. The first thing is just getting together with your community and your coworkers. Unions are one of the bulwarks against unfair treatment. Many people, in particularly, Black Americans, have fought so devastatingly hard over the course of centuries, but especially the 20th century, to get civil rights legislation passed so that, you don't have to tell your manager when there's, something going on in your personal life. The civil rights legislation that was really, pushed forward, pushed ahead by Black Americans, it was a benefit to so many groups. And so we don't have the same landscape of discrimination that we once did. And what I'll say is, even going back to, the point in time where you could either legally or maybe illegally, but it was still completely fine to fire a woman for, say, getting married or having a child, you still see a lot of people pushing back, so there are women's unions that are coming together to push back. There are women who are literally, and this is a quote, having babies in secret so that they don't lose their jobs. There's one very prominent woman who many of you may have heard of if you're into the history of computing, named Steve Shirley, or Stephanie Shirley is her full name, but she went by Steve. And she ultimately became a billionaire because she started one of the first freelance software company. She called it Freelance Programmers. And she did so because she kept hitting the glass ceiling. And so in the 60s, she said, I'm going to start my own thing. And, really, really early on, before people understood that you could make money in software, because people at that time just expected software to come with the machine, or for the employees of whatever company or government office that installed the machine, they would program it. And she saw that that was not going to be feasible, that to unlock the power of these massive computers, you were going to need trained specialists who were providing this labor. And she starts this company with the idea that she is going to hire the other women like her who are getting squeezed out of the workforce because they're women, because they're getting married, because they have children. And she gives them flexible, family-friendly work from home working conditions. So there's this wonderful picture, for instance, of a woman who was eventually the technical director of her company, programming on paper, because back in the day, computer time was too expensive to program on a mainframe. You programmed on paper first, and you tried to get everything bug-free and right before you tested it. She's programming on paper in her kitchen, at her kitchen table, and her little baby is kind of looking up, looking on. And she's actually programming the black box flight recorder for the Concorde, which is to date still an amazing feat of both political and technological just achievement. It's the only, supersonic aircraft that's been put into service as a passenger jet. I mean, it was called Europe's Space Race, and she's programming from her kitchen table while minding her child, and doing so because she had the skills, and regardless, she got squeezed out of her job. But they still needed that labor. They still needed that skill. And that's why Steve Shirley's company, Freelance Programmer, kept getting work, even as weird as that seems.
That's so interesting. Thank you for sharing that story. I was also thinking, what happened to this woman after the Second World War? Like, were they still able to continue on that work, on the tech work, or there was something else, like an government intention or a more systematic intention for erase them or put them back from those spaces?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And let me step back a second to do a little bit of a timeline to ground us. So during World War II, some of you may know that Bletchley Park in the UK was enormously important to helping the Allies turn the tide of World War II and win. Literally, it was instrumental in the success of the D-Day landings. What you might not know actually is behind the scenes, what was really so important to making sure the D-Day landings were successful was intelligence support and code breaking that was done by computer. The Colossus computers that were, you guessed it, run by women. And these women, after the war, they couldn't talk at all about their top secret work. They had to sign, in fact, the Official Secrets Act that said, if you ever talk about this, the penalty is death. Many people who worked at Bletchley Park didn't ever talk about what they did. They went to their graves with those secrets. Women held these secrets from their families, from their husbands, for their entire lives. When we reach about the 1970s, people start to come out and feel like they can say some things about this, because basically that's when some of the information about what went on in Bletchley Park with the computers starts to become known. It starts to come out. But in the interim, those women didn't really have any entree, right, into computing after the war. But there were also tons and tons of women who were doing work on non-electronic computers, on electromechanical machines. And they're the ones, actually, the ones who are doing the less glamorous administrative work. They carry right over. They're already in the government. They're already doing stuff for the war effort that isn't, say, code breaking. And they carry right over into post-war government offices. They're there as these electromechanical systems start to become electronic and computerized. They're the ones who are shepherding these systems forward. And there's also lots of women in industry doing this as well, because of, as I mentioned, the assumptions about what technical work was like at this time and who was the right sort of person to slot into these roles. And again, it's a paradox because, you know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Margot Lee Shetterly's amazing work, her fabulous book, Hidden Figures, and the film that's based on it. If you've seen the film and you haven't read the book, please read the book. I'm not going to say it's better, but it's different. It does things the film can't do. And one of the things that is so important about that book is that it shows how these Black women who were essentially, they were geniuses. The United States needed their labor and their expertise in this crisis of the Cold War, and it used them and their skills and talents and benefited from those and valued those, while all this at the same time depriving them of their civil rights in the wider world. You know, Shetterly says at one point, you know, in the late 60s and the 1970s, the United States could put a man on the moon, but Black people still couldn't drive to the next state safely in a lot of cases. And so you also have this situation where, you know, why is her book called Hidden Figures? Well, it's because she knew these women existed. They were in her community when she was growing up, and yet they were so invisibilized that when she started writing and researching the book, people doubted that they existed at all, or that they, you know, it was just kind of like a one-off or a two-off. She found hundreds of them, right? And so when you look at what's happening today with certain people being taken off websites, being taken off government websites, I heard history is now a banned word. Well, I mean, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. There's a lot of power in knowledge, not just in information. There's a lot of power in knowledge. And the distinction, right, is that knowledge is something that we construct from information in order to create connections that allow us to learn and to have insights about broader things. You know, it's sort of the difference between reading a book and reading the phone book. But anyway, I'm going to stop there because it looks like you wanted to jump in with.
Well, I also read on your book about how the narrative outline and the government intervention in the shifts of the job market was impacting also the woman's role in tech. It was something more intentional that I thought, and that was really heartbreaking to learn. So if you can share a bit more how that was shaped and why, and what broader consequences did this for the industry.
Yeah, this gets to the crux of the book. So the whole reason I wrote this book was because when I was coming up, computer science and using computers was already kind of perceived as more of a masculine sort of interest, a male-dominated field. And yet, my first job in computing, you know, I was a Unix systems administrator for a while. I was one of the only people, you know, I was in my 20s, all the younger folks around me were dudes. And our big bosses, they were both women. And my mother worked in tech, and a lot of her women friends worked in tech. And now that's, you know, in the United States, but it basically got me thinking about what's going on here. Things are proceeding in a way that doesn't seem like the progressive historical narrative that we're sort of primed to expect. And, you know, my women bosses would say, well, you don't understand. There used to be a lot more women in computing. And so the crux of, you know, this research that became the book was, well, what happened? When did this gendered labor flip occur? And I had initially hoped to make it a comparative story between the US and the UK. But the problem is that so many of the companies that were important in this period in the mid to late 20th century in computing, in the US, they're still in operation. IBM is still in operation. I wrote to IBM, I asked if I could use their archives. They were like, no, we don't really want you messing around in that way. And so I went to look at a context where they had this really striking fall from grace. You know, they had the first digital electronic computer that they deployed to do something really important: cyber warfare, geopolitics, winning a world war. I mean, big stuff. And then they're matching US accomplishments in computing for a lot of the 1950s. And then they fall off dramatically. And I thought that was really interesting and did not understand that it was connected to the labor story, to the gendered labor flip, until very, very late in my research. I thought I was going to be telling kind of a background story of computing's rise and fall in the UK, and then a smaller story of gendered labor change. And what I realized was that what happened with computing's rise and fall was tightly linked to the fact that the UK decided on a governmental and industry level to essentially push out the people who were trained and skilled at doing these jobs, because at a certain point, they realized just how powerful the people who could run and could understand these automating systems, how powerful they were going to become. They were going to be in the role of being managerial, essentially. And at that point, in the mid to late 20th century, women were not supposed to hold that kind of power. They were not supposed to even manage teams of men in a lot of cases, or manage mixed staffs. And so at this point, essentially in the late 50s to early 1960s, you see a push to, in fact, get a lot of women out of these jobs, to have them train their replacements, and to bring in the UK, what were called, sort of good career-minded, bright young men who the idea was would be able to manage people as well as machines, go from machine room to boardroom, and to build the infrastructure of a new British empire. The British wanted to use computing to create Empire 2.0. They had used other technologies, military technologies, transportation technologies, guns, boats, etc., to create Empire 1.0. They saw their power on the world stage, slipping away from them, receding. And so they decided that potentially computing would be the way to get back there. And that's why they were so invested in getting it right, in having it be a homegrown national industry where they didn't have to rely on US technology or foreign technology, because they saw very early on the threat, the back door that could be gotten into government and industry through providing that kind of infrastructure. And they wanted to deploy that threat against other nations and not have it deployed against themselves. And so an interesting thing happens as they're trying to do this and get more bright young men of management caliber into these jobs, and get them trained up because they don't have the skills to do the technical work. They really start to shoot themselves in the foot, and they understand that they're shooting themselves in the foot, and they have a programmer labor crisis in the mid 1960s. And that's actually when a whole bunch more women get into the field, because management is so desperate to have anybody to do these jobs that they say, okay, we'll hire women, and we'll train them to do these more kind of high caliber tech jobs. But that doesn't last very long. However, that is why, for instance, some women, like the woman on the cover of my book, Kathy Gillespie, she has this very long and illustrious career in computing, because she gets in at that sweet spot in the mid 60s, and then she never leaves. She never leaves to get married or anything like that. And so she stays in. But most women, if they get married, if they leave to have children, they essentially get pushed out through this turnover. And by the 1970s, what you see is sort of there was this great line, what was it? Mia said, "We are witnessing institutional failure 101, and that it's not an anomaly, it's a symptom." And that's exactly what you see in the history that I wrote in Programmed Inequality. You see institutional failure where the British government in particular is so wedded to a particular style of management and surveillance and power, and who should hold that power. What kind of people should hold that power? That they say, well, okay, we're just going to have to function with this very small labor force since we can't get more people because we want them to be a certain kind of person. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell the British computing industry to build massive centralized mainframe technologies so that these management caliber technocrats can essentially rule from a very centralized perch. And so these massive mainframes for essentially government, but the idea is that they'll also be deployed in industry, that they'll be sold, to government as well as industry. And the UK government forces a merger of all the remaining viable computing companies in the late 1960s, specifically for this end, to create a company that can be an IBM competitor and can provide these sorts of massive mainframe solutions. And they do this at a point in time when the big mainframe is on the way out, when we're going to more decentralized solutions and smaller mainframes. And so by the time ICL, which is the company the merged company they create, presents and has ready this incredibly technologically advanced system that they asked for, that the government asked for, nobody wants it anymore. Not even the government, and certainly not industry, except for maybe like a few really huge companies. And it just continues, to exacerbate the decline. It's a huge kind of drop off in not just the UK computing industry, but the national fortunes of the country that have been tied into automation and that have been tied into this industry as a potential engine of future growth, in much the same way I'll say that, like, the United States is tying our fortunes into, oh, AI is going to be the next big thing. It's going to be the moneymaker. It's going to be the thing that revolutionizes everything. And a lot of people are saying, hey, hang on, that's maybe not possible or probable or great, and there's going to be a lot of labor problems associated with that. I mean, the echoes are so, if not similar, at least like really close. It's distressing. It's really distressing because these are lessons that are easy to learn.
I'll just jump in for a quick second. Since we did run late, as per the agenda, we are supposed to have yoga and cats, but we are going to move that out to give Professor Hicks the entire 45 minutes or 50 minutes. And for folks, I'm excited for yoga and cats, but we will do this during our social hour. So if you can hang in there until social hour, we're really looking forward to it. I'm very excited to have you stay with us. Yes, it will be very fun, and we are really looking forward to it. We love cats and we love yoga. So yeah, Joanna.
Thank you, Mia. So this is an incredible story about institutional failure. I can see also how that is repeating nowadays. It's oh my God, sorry. That was my husband's birthday. Yeah, don't worry. Well, what I was saying is that we are seeing that happening, that history happening again. And we have the government intervention really much with the private interest. And we also have these important history lessons. So I don't know, Professor Marks, if you want to jump on some comments about how ideally, in a, in an ideal world, how the private sector and the government could be seeing these history lessons and try to have, to create better context for all of us.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I'll say about people who are good programmers and good in their tech jobs in general, whether they work in QA or project management or the programmers or whatever, is that they, unlike the people who seem to get all the airtime in, newspapers and online, they understand that technology is not a one and done solution. We call it software development for a reason. Technologies are infrastructures and they have to be consistently maintained. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because whenever we are sort of sold fantastical ideas about what new technologies can do, we are always sold that on the basis that they are going to somehow be revolutionary. They're going to change power relations in a way that is positive for the mass of people, not just giving more power to those at the top. They usually actually do the thing where they intensify the existing power balances. But the people who work on this stuff day to day know that it's a process and it's a struggle. And one of the things that, I heard today is, and there's so many layers to this, so I'll try not to go on too long about it, but I heard that, the current government is thinking of rewriting the software that runs the Social Security Administration, that's written in COBOL. And they're going to potentially use AI to essentially rewrite it and then deploy it within a really short period of time, like 2 months, basically with no testing. And there's a lot of people who have said, and I think they're right, that this is actually an intentional effort to break systems and not fix them again. But even if we just say, take them at their word, the COBOL systems that are in place, not just in government, but, COBOL is still very widely used throughout the world, especially in banking, like all the credit card transactions that, are done every day. COBOL is something that was designed to be not only stable, but interpretable by people who could come in and change that code later. It was literally built to last. And I use that phrase actually because I wrote an article about COBOL that you can see on Logic magazine that's called Built to Last. And it was about how well these systems did during the early pandemic when everybody had to be filing claims for, unemployment insurance. And much was made about the crashes, the few crashes that occurred, and blaming this old language, COBOL, when in fact, what was to blame was disinvestment in these systems, disinvestment in the social safety net that we all pay for with our taxes. And those taxes, we'll see whether they go to the things that we're actually told we're paying for or not. But to go back to your question about, other things that are being done that people can do to kind of make sure that what's happening in a top-down way doesn't push them out or push things in a direction it shouldn't go. There are so many people that I could, name here, and I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of them are women of color. Timnit Gebru, April Curley, Sophie Zhang, Annika Collier-Navaroli, who have been absolutely critical in mobilizing action and whistleblowing every step of the way as these increasingly automated systems that we're sort of caught in now become things that reflect the interests of the few and not the interests of the many. And I would really, really say that one of the things that we have to do more, and I'm not saying anything original here, is we have to pay more attention to Black women and Black women technologists, because they have been telling us every step of the way very clearly where we're going, why we're going there, and what's going to happen, and what we should do to not have these things happen if that's not where we want to go. And it's not just people in the industry. There are activists like Tawana Petty, the late Shafiqua Hudson, Rael Ainasakiam, people who have all along been basically from the outside, in addition to the inside, stress testing and talking about the flaws in these systems that are really huge systemic problems that just haven't flared into the public view yet. And then years later, when they do, a lot of time their work doesn't get the credit that it should. So I just want to call them out. If you want to read more about them, you can look up some of those names. If you didn't catch the names, I wrote a piece recently for First Monday, which is free online to read, called History in the Making, Whistleblowers in Big Tech. And in it, you're probably going to read about at least a few, whistleblowers, I'm using that term very expansively, that you didn't know about yet. This isn't all about like Frances Haugen. So I feel like I've gotten a little far away potentially from the question you were asking. It was such a good, big question that I want to throw it back to you before I say anything more.
Great. Thank you for sharing those reflections. If you want to also share some names that you want all of us to keep following, like the Work for More woman, Black woman, people of color, we will be really happy to hear your advices. Also, we are very happy to keep promoting the work of more diverse people here. And I'm gonna go now to our next question, that it is kind of one of the, I don't know if this is gonna give us more hope or it's gonna make us hungrier than before, but let's try it. So your book outlines many societal preconceptions that hindered women's advancement in computing, right? Could we list some of the key biases that existed in the mid-20th century in Britain, and discuss how they still persist today?
I would say that, we can talk about sexism, we can talk about racism, we can talk about classism, but essentially what it boils down to then and now, it's about power and about who the people in power want to bring into the fold, who those in power think should be in power. I think Mia, when she was talking about all of the things that have happened and are, we're kind of pushing back against, I think she made a comment that a lot of times the people who don't look like those in power, who maybe get a seat at the table, they either don't hold it very long if they actually remain true to their values, or they hold on to it at the expense of actually having a voice that reflects their community, because they have to fit into the power structure. And that is something that we see all throughout, this particular history in programmed inequality, that it's all about ensuring that a particular social order in a particular power structure persists. And that feels terribly antiquated and like almost sinister, until you see what's going on right now, and you see that we're literally seeing people crowing, people in our government crowing about undoing DEI. And like, let's spell that out. There's diversity and inclusion in DEI, which you'd think those are good things, but the E is for equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you have people who are saying with their full chest, we want to undo equity. We don't want equity. What we want is a specific power structure that historically puts certain people over others. And they are saying that right out loud. And unfortunately, it means that this history I wrote, instead of seeming antiquated and like it's in the past and we've moved beyond it, unfortunately, it means that it's very relevant. But all around us in this book festival, in the organization that you're a part of, we see people pushing back. We see avenues for pushing back. We understand that it's never one and done, that there isn't just a moment where people win or lose. It is consistently a process and a struggle. And history doesn't really have beginnings and endings. Books do. And it's hard to find where to begin and end a book, right? Because those beginnings and endings are fake. They're fake. It keeps going. There's always another chance to do something horrible. There's always another chance to do something good. And I'll offer that just as a bit of hope for people who I know are very, very tired, probably, of doing this work consistently. And yet I know they're going to keep going once they're able to, once they have a bit of time to rest, because this is not something that ends, right? And when we end, other people will take the baton and carry it forward. This is not something where they're just going to have a technology that fixes everything. And this is not going to be a situation either where they have a technology that permanently destroys everything. They can make things very bad. They can make things very hard, but people are becoming more and more awake to what's happening. And that is a big part of how we get out of a lot of these problematic, let's just say problematic situations that we find ourselves in right now with technology and power, that we've always been in it, but now it's just more obvious than ever. It's really undeniable. It's right in our faces.
Great. Thank you so much for these last comments. I think that we ended with a more positive vibe on that, and that's good. That's good to encourage all of us to keep participating in this kind of conversations. Thank you so much, Professor Mar Hicks, for joining us. Please follow Professor Mar Hicks on LinkedIn and her website to keep updated on her work. Also, do not forget to buy her books. She also has published another amazing book. Read it and joining us on our next reading circle. Thank you, Professor Mar Hicks. Please stay with us. We still have more books coming today at this AI Ethics Book Fair Festival.
Thank you so much for having me.